Hey folks, I hope that you guys are doing pretty well. So today is Friday, the 27th of February 2026, and I'm just showing you here my Bible, the Bible that changed the world. That's right folks, this is my Bible here, one of them. This is one of my two main Bibles. Now, the reason that I actually had to buy the Bible, again, if you like, on my second copy of the same Bible, is that on my first one, it got scribbled quite a lot and it got really highlighted everywhere, fully marked and everything as I was doing biblical decipherings and studying the Bible. So this is actually my second one, and I bought this Bible on the 27th of the 10th, 2024 at Dimox. This is the bookstore in which I bought it at downtown Sydney. So I just wanted to highlight my own quote, Gabriel the Prophet, the Bible that changed the world. Or in other words, this Bible changed the world because I prophesy the rapture of the church. And doing all my biblical decipherings, okay, led me to God rewarding me with a rapture of the church prophecy. So this Bible changed the world. You might look at it and think to yourself, wow, it's a book here, it's more than a book, of course, it's a word of God. I think it cost me somewhere between $12 to $15, somewhere around there. But yeah, this is the Bible that changed the world. And I got another quote here from Shalom 132 YouTube channel from the main rabbi there. This is the sacrifice that God made for humanity. Of course, after the fall of Adam and Eve, if you like. So after doing many biblical decipherings, God rewarded me, finally with the rapture of the church. And I only read the King James Bible, okay? For some reason, I cannot decipher using other Bibles. The only one that I can decipher with is the King James. It's the only Bible that I study, so that's actually quite incredible. Now, what do I have for you today, folks, in terms of biblical decipherings, if you like? Today I'm going to be talking about the three mentoring prophets of Israel, okay? And how they become servants of God afterwards, okay? And so yeah, they become servants of God, destined by the Lord, okay, afterwards. Now there is a pattern in here, the mantle versus the oil, okay? So this is what I'm going to be discussing today, the three mentoring prophets of Israel and how they become servants of God, destined by the Lord afterwards. And the pattern, mantle versus oil, there is a difference, folks. Now, Moses, of course, was the first mantling prophet, if you like. Okay, so Moses was the first mantling prophet, in inverted commas, in the history of Israel. Okay, now God orders Moses to lay his hands upon Joshua to take over him. See, of course, Numbers 27, verses 18 to 23. This is the transfer of power, okay? One mantle to the next, from one prophet to the next, if you like. See also Deuteronomy 34, verse 9. Now, notice how there was no oil, no anointing oil, okay, poured upon Joshua. That's interesting. There is a reason why Joshua didn't get the oil, okay? Now, so it seems then that at the beginning of Israel's kings, okay, oil was used. There is a reason for the oil. King Saul and King David were anointed by Samuel the prophet, and kings, with oil, if you like, and King Solomon was anointed with the oil in a ceremony by Zadok the priest in the presence of Nathan the prophet. Now, the Bible does not mention Moses physically passing on the mantle to Joshua, okay? So the Bible doesn't say that, Moses mentored Joshua, but nonetheless, he transferred his power to Joshua, But I guess more Bible scholars call that the mantling, in other words, a transfer of power, if you like. Now, of course, the Bible doesn't mention that Moses, mantle Joshua, okay, with a physical mantle or a cloak. he actually laid his hands upon Joshua's head, okay, commanded by God. Now, is it possible that perhaps Moses actually had a mantle and he put it over, on Joshua? It is possible. I don't really know. The thing about Moses' mantle is that because he was a Levite, then his mantle would have been marked with, perhaps Levite colors or Levite symbolism, if you like. And because Joshua was not a Levite, he was from the tribe of Ephraim, perhaps Moses could not physically mantle Joshua. That's one possibility. But perhaps he did. I don't really know the full story, but the Bible tells us that Moses only laid hands upon Joshua, commanded by God, and he did not put a mantle. Perhaps he did, maybe he didn't, I don't know, to Joshua. The Bible is not clear on that, but that's actually interesting. But for argument's sake, let's just say that Moses was a mentoring prophet because of the transfer of power, okay? Even though the Bible doesn't mention that, because the Bible does not mention Moses physically passing on a mantle to Joshua like Elijah did to Elisha. But the main issue to take note of in here is the transfer of power, okay, from one prophet to the next without the pouring of oil, okay. Now there is a reason why oil was used, and there is a reason why a mantle was used, okay, and I'm going to tell you the difference. Now, Elijah was the second prophet, if you like, to fully, but rather he was really the first, because we don't really know if actually Moses passed on the mantle to to Joshua, so we don't fully know. But Elisha was perhaps the first prophet to fully physically mantle the prophet Elisha, which he was, because we don't fully know about Moses, to take over from him. Okay, so it's kind of like a tricky one. Notice again how no oil, okay, was poured upon Elisha the prophet. There is an interesting pattern applying here. Thus far, in the times of the first three kings of Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon, they all had the oil poured upon them, but notice no mantle, since mantle versus oil. Okay, so this is actually interesting. So King Saul, King David, and Solomon, they were all oiled, if you like, or oil was poured upon them, but notice no mantle. Now, according to this pattern, thus far, the oil, it seems, okay, is only reserved for kings only, because Saul, David, and Solomon, they were anointed with oil, okay. Now, of course, Saul and David were anointed by Samuel with oil, and Solomon was anointed by Zadok, okay. The priest Zadok actually poured the oil on him, and the prophet Nathan was there watching, if you like, as a witness. Now, according to this pattern, then oil versus mantle, thus far the oil is reserved for kings, okay, because these kings were oiled, if you like, whereas the laying of hands and the mantle, okay, are reserved for prophets. And so there seems to be a pattern of distinction in here. Now, when Israel anoints their own prophet in the second half of the tribulation period, this will be done by a mantle only, by my mantle, okay. And I already said to Israel that they're entitled to have my mantle. But anyway, let's get to point number 3. Gabriel, me, the prophet. I am the third mantling prophet, but perhaps the second physically, but prophet in the history of Israel, after Moses and Elijah, but perhaps after Elijah only, or the third prophet, as well, with Moses in the transferring power to Israel's own chosen prophet, okay, with a mission to unite the Jewish people unto Jesus Christ. I also leave my mantle behind for Israel to mantle their own chosen prophet. However, there are some important things to consider in here. I am the second prophet after Elijah to leave his mantle behind on earth, just like Elijah did after the prophet Elijah. And of course, I said earlier that Moses laid his hands on Joshua, but the Bible does not mention Moses as in mantling Joshua physically. But nonetheless, we are the three major mantling prophets, if you like, or the transferers of power in the history of Israel to transfer our prophetic power, if you like, to the next prophet, taking over succession. Okay, so even though just to recap here, even though Moses didn't have a mantle, he was ordered by God to lay hands on Joshua, so he did transfer his power to Joshua. So did Elijah, and so am I. So we are the three mantling prophets, if you like, to transfer our prophetic power to the next set of prophets. But of course, Moses is the exception in that he laid his hand, whereas Elijah and myself physically, we left our mantles behind. Elijah is a bit different to me in that he actually got to physically mantle Elisha. I can't do that physically because I'm asleep before the rapture of the church, but I'm leaving my mantles behind. Yes, plural. I use different mantles in my days of prophesying, and one of them was actually a black vest, which I gave to Israel, or said to Israel they can have it. I still have it here on my wardrobe. The other mantle that is missing, I don't know where it went. It was actually a light blue vest that I used to prophesy. I actually prophesied the Sidon Bible prophecy to Israel, and I actually lost that vest. I don't know where it went, but I consider that one of my mantles. So sadly I lost that. I was never able to recover it, but nonetheless, unlike Elijah got to physically mantle Elisha, but I'm leaving my mantle behind because I cannot do that. But nonetheless, I'm transferring power, just like prophetic power, just like Moses, Elijah, and myself. So yeah, this is actually quite interesting. So in a parallel manner, King Saul, King David, and King Solomon succeeded one another by the oil, inasmuch as Moses, Elijah, and myself, the prophet, the three of us have gave and I'm giving power to, following prophets, if you like, with a mantle. But of course, Moses, with the line of hand, then kings, succeeded one another, by the oil and not the line of hands or the mantle. But the main difference between the oil versus the mantle is that God chose those with a mantle, to serve Him in heaven. Exactly. Now, let me tell you more about this. Both Moses and Elijah, mantling prophets, or the line of the hands, if you like, with Moses, are the two olive trees and the two anointed ones that stand by the Lord. Moses and Elijah, in other words, the mantling prophets, the first ones, like Moses, Elijah, and myself, they get to serve God in heaven, the ones with the mantle or the line of the hands like Moses, but not the ones with the oil. You see, there is a difference between the mantle and the oil. The mantling prophets, they have to do extra work afterwards. They get to serve God in heaven because Moses and Elijah are the two olive trees that stand before God, the two anointed ones that stand by the Lord. Moses and Elijah see Zechariah 4 verses 11 and 14, and Daniel 12:5, Revelation 11:4, and Matthew 17:3, the transfiguration of Jesus. Now, let me get back to the transfiguration of Jesus in a moment. Now, Gabriel the prophet, me, was prophesied by God. I'm going to take you out. I want you to serve me in heaven. So, do you see how the mentoring prophets like Moses, Elijah, and myself, Gabriel, we are mentoring prophets. We get to serve God, for all eternity. But the oil, prophets like King Saul, who was a prophet, he prophesied a little bit. King David, who prophesied a lot, and also King Solomon, who prophesied a lot as well. They received the oil because they were kings. So oil is reserved for kings, whereas mantle are reserved for prophets. And so Israel has to mantle, the prophet that comes from me, that is succeeding me. Israel has to mantle him instead of pouring the oil on him, because oil is reserved for kings, whereas the mantle is reserved for prophets. Okay, that's why I left my mantle behind. Okay, now, so yes, just like Moses, Elijah, and myself, we serve God because we carry a mantle. So it seems then that the three major mantling prophets, but of course, Moses laid hands upon Joshua, but the Bible doesn't say whether Moses passed a mantle or not, but let's just say that, if he didn't, then spiritually he passed on his prophetic power unto Joshua anyway. They continue to serve God in heaven, and so will I. But the oil kings, the Bible doesn't mention them as serving God in heaven. So, the oil kings, or the kings that receive the oil, like King Saul, King David, and King Solomon, it doesn't say that they are serving God in heaven right now, but the mantling prophets, the three major ones like Moses, Elijah, and myself, I will in the future, but Moses and Elijah are already serving God in heaven already as the true anointed ones that stand before God. Now, one of the interesting things about Matthew 17 verse 3 is that when Jesus had a transfiguration in Mount Tabor, okay, there was Peter there, James and John. The interesting thing is that notice how Moses and Elijah appear unto Jesus, and they said that one of them said it might not be Moses, who represents the law. You will die in Jerusalem, Now, if you think about that, and you also think about Enoch, it's possible then that because Moses and Elijah appear in glory unto Jesus, then maybe they weren't in Abraham's bosom, they were actually in heaven, because Elijah was taken by the whirlwind to heaven. That's what the Bible says. And Enoch walked with God, and then he was not. Now, the Bible doesn't say much about Moses. Moses, God told that he had to go to Mount Nebo to die. He was ordered by God. And then God buried his body. But, the Bible doesn't say that he went up to heaven. But if you think about how he appeared, how Moses and Elijah appeared unto Jesus on Mount Tabor, it's possible that also Moses went to heaven as well. And of course, Enoch as well. So both Enoch, Moses, and Elijah, perhaps they actually never went to the bosom of Abraham, but they actually went straight to heaven. So, I can't say this 100% for sure. The Bible tells us that, both Enoch and Elijah went to heaven. So, it doesn't say that they went to the bosom of Abraham. So that's actually quite interesting. Because I'm sure that in the bosom of Abraham, Abraham was actually there because it's named after him. Many prophets who have been there, So that's actually interesting. I don't have all the answers, but That's actually an interesting point in itself. So it's interesting that, just to finish up, that there is a difference between the mantle and the oil. The oil is actually reserved for kings only, whereas the mantle is reserved for prophets. And there's different offices. You got the office of the Levites, if you like. In other words, the office of the priesthood. You got the office of the kings, the kings of Israel, and then you have the office of the prophets. So there's three different offices, in the leadership of Israel, and then you also have the elders of Israel. You can probably say that's a fourth office. So you got the kings of Israel, the prophets of Israel, the Levite priesthood, and you also have the elders of Israel. So you have four different offices working in partnership to lead Israel, and it's interesting that the three Mantle prophets, or the three mantling prophets, of course, like I said earlier, Moses like hands, but Elijah and myself are mantling prophets, that we actually get to serve God in heaven. But it's also interesting that the ones that succeeded us, like Joshua in the case of Moses, Elisha in the case of Elijah, and Israel's prophet that will succeed me, the Bible doesn't mention thus far that they get to serve God in heaven. It's only the first ones, the ones that carry the first mantle, that get to serve God. And interestingly enough, the Mantle prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and the minor prophets, they didn't carry a mantle, so to speak, compared to, especially Elijah and myself. That's actually interesting. John the Baptist wore an interesting garment, okay, but I'm not sure if that was a mantle or not, but or part of his clothing. But for sure, of course, Elijah and myself are actually the true mantling prophets in the history of Israel. So this needs to be, clarified. The oil is reserved for kings, mantles are reserved for Mantle prophets, and those that carry the mantle get to serve God. Moses, of course, is a special guy, he like hands, but nonetheless, he can be considered a spiritual mantling prophet in that there's only ever been three Mantle prophets that passed on their, prophetic power, if you like, to their successor prophet. In other words, that we are sort of like mantling prophets, Moses, Elijah, and myself. So yeah, it's actually quite interesting. Alright folks, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you all later. I guess I'm just gonna give you a bit of a scan here on my deciphering so that you can read it for yourselves in your own time. And so yeah, I thought that I'd talk about this today, because of course Israel has to mantle their prophet in the second half of the tribulation period, as soon as Moses and Elijah leave, like I already have prophesied to Israel several times already. And so yes, like I said, I used different mantles to prophesy to Israel. I used my black vest at first when I was prophesying to the church and to Israel also, but then I had a blue vest, light blue vest, that I used to prophesy. The Sidon prophecy I remember, but I could not find that in my home anymore. I don't know where it went, but anyway, that was actually one of my mantles. Alright folks, thanks for watching. I'll talk to you all later. And this is actually my second Bible that I use. This is actually the Sun model, but I bought it at a different period of time. And this is actually one of the Bibles that changed the world, because as I began doing biblical decipherings, right, God rewarded me with prophesying big prophecies, things like that, you know. So yes, it's actually incredible. All right, folks, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.